In this video, we'll see how to create a trigger that gets executed when the user tries to insert a record. The trigger will check to see if inserting that record would violate a business rule, and if it does, it will stop the record from being inserted. The context here will be looking at appointments. So if a proposed new appointment conflicts with an existing appointment, we'll want the trigger to prevent that proposed new appointment from being recorded. So let's take a look at the records that are currently scheduled, the appointments that are currently scheduled for a particular day. And let's look at the 2nd of June, 2016. So we have these 32 records selected. It'll probably be helpful to take a look at these graphically. So here are the 32 appointments that are scheduled for this day. Now, let's suppose that we have a requested new appointment for this time, beginning at 10:30 a.m. and going for 55 minutes. We can see that it would conflict with any of the appointments that share a time with that request. And so that would be all of these appointments. Now, in a prior video, we created a function called conflict count that would take some information, specifically a particular start time, a duration, and a counselor, and it would tell us how many conflicts that client or that counselor would have with the proposed appointment. And so we can take a look at that for a particular appointment, in this case Abigail Smith, and we'll see that there is one appointment that conflicts. If we were to look at that same information for a different counselor, Elizabeth Baker, we'll see that there are two conflicting appointments. And if we take a look at both James Sawyer and Quinn Fowler, we'll see that they each have one conflict. However, if we look at Leslie Wright for this particular time, we'll see that there are no conflicts. And so we should expect the trigger that we're creating to reject the insertion of this particular requested appointment if it's made for Abigail Smith or Elizabeth Baker or the others that have a conflict. But if we try to insert it for Leslie Wright, then it should allow it to proceed. So here's what we're going to try to accomplish. Create a trigger that will, when someone tries to insert an appointment, check to see if there are more than 0 conflicting appointments, and if so, prevent the record from being inserted and explain to the user why the record was rejected. And so to create a trigger, we'll use the create trigger statement. Similar to creating functions or procedures, we can also add the or replace clause that will allow us to write over the top of an existing trigger by that name. Now, the first thing that we specify when we're creating a trigger is when we want that trigger to be executed. So in this case, we want it to be executed before a record is inserted. So it will be initialized when the user requests to reinsert a record, but before that record is allowed to be put into the table, this trigger will execute. We then need to tell it which table that we want to bind it to. And so we'll say we'll bind it to the appointment table. So now, once we've created this trigger, when a user tries to create a record in that table, then this trigger will execute before that record is allowed to be inserted. Now we're going to tell it how often we want it to execute. So it's possible for one insert statement to insert multiple records. By default, this trigger would run just once for that insert statement that's putting multiple records in. And so we want to validate every single record, and so we'll put the for each row clause here as well. Now we're ready to declare any local variables that we might need, and we will want one because we'll need one to keep track of how many conflicts there are. We'll be running that function called conflict count, but we need some way to collect the results of that function, and that's what we'll use this variable for. Now we're ready to begin the work of the function. So let's just bring in our prior statement that we used to count the number of conflicts for a particular counselor. Now, of course, we don't want to have the start date and time hard-coded, and so we'll replace that date literal with a way that we can read the value for the start time that's trying to be inserted into the appointment table. The way that we take a look at that value before it's inserted is by using the prefix :new dot. And so that will give us the ability to peek at the value before it's inserted. We'll do something similar for the duration of the appointment, as well as for the counselor the appointment is to be scheduled for. Now, we've got to read that value into our variable, and so we'll use the into clause. So this will bring the value, the result from our conflict count function, into our vConflicts variable as we execute that query. So now we'll want to check to see if that variable is larger than 0. And if it is, we'll want to reject the insertion. The way we do that is by raising an error. And so we will say raise application error, and then we'll give it the details for the error. We'll give it a number. The number is so that an application that's running this an insert statement that gets the value back will be able to look at just the number and know what's happened. And so the number that we choose here is arbitrary, but we'll need to communicate that number to a developer so that they can interpret the return response accurately. And we'll also give a value that can be read by a human. And so in this case, when the error happens, it'll say cannot add appointment. There is a conflicting appointment for, and then it'll put the name of the counselor that's trying to be inserted. And that's the end of the work of the trigger. So we will now close off the create trigger statement, and we will execute it. So now let's try to insert a record that would conflict with existing appointments. So this insert statement is requesting that particular time for Elizabeth Baker, and we can see that she has 2 conflicting appointments. We should expect this insert statement now to be rejected. And in fact, when we try to execute it, Oracle tells us it cannot add the appointment. There's a conflicting appointment for Elizabeth Baker, and you can see that has the number that we specified as the particular error number that we wanted to communicate. Now let's see what happens if we try to add a record that doesn't conflict. And so here's the insert statement for Leslie Wright at that particular time where there is no conflict, and we should expect this record to go in just fine. And we can see that it does. The record gets created. And so we've now successfully created a trigger that will check to see if there are any conflicts in the appointment time for the counselor that's chosen for that appointment, and reject the insertion if it is. And of course, it will allow the insertion to happen if there are no conflicts. So that's creating a trigger to look at a business rule and reject the insert if that rule would be violated.